20 rings were forged, 20 rings that were supposed to unite the free peoples of Middle-earth. But one hand, one dark forge, and one whispered incantation turned every single one of them into a weapon aimed at their own bearers. Most people know the phrase, "one ring to rule them all." Almost nobody knows what the other 19 actually did. And the truth is far darker than a simple story about invisibility. So let's break down every single ring of power, what it actually granted its wearer, and how each one became a leash around the neck of Middle-earth itself. Let's start at the very beginning, because the rings didn't start as instruments of evil, they started as a gift. In the Second Age, the elven smiths of Eregion, led by a craftsman gifted beyond any mortal understanding, began forging rings of incredible power. Their goal was simple and, honestly, noble. They wanted to preserve beauty, to stop decay, to protect the lands they loved from fading with time. What they didn't know was that the charming stranger helping them refine their craft, the one offering guidance and secrets of ring making, was not who he claimed to be. He was the greatest deceiver in the history of Middle-earth, and he was about to turn their masterpiece into a trap. 7 rings went to the lords of the dwarves, 9 went to the kings of men, 3, crafted purely by the elves without any outside interference, remained untouched by his corruption. And in secret, apart from all the others, 1 ring was forged in the fires of a mountain built for exactly that purpose. That ring was designed to contain a piece of its maker's own power, and, through that shared essence, to command every other ring that existed. This wasn't a story about 19 equal artifacts and 1 extra. It was a trap built into the very architecture of the gift. Let's talk about the Dwarf Rings first, because their story is honestly one of the strangest in the entire legendarium. 7 rings, given to 7 dwarf lords. You'd expect corruption, right? Domination, control, maybe transformation into wraiths, like what happened to men. But dwarves are stubborn. Dwarves are, according to their own creation myth, tougher-willed than almost any other race in Middle-earth. So instead of being enslaved outright, the rings did something different to them. They amplified greed. Not obedience, not submission, greed. Every dwarf lord who wore one of these rings became consumed by an unstoppable hunger for gold, for treasure, for wealth beyond reason. Entire dwarf kingdoms crumbled not because they were commanded to serve a dark master, but because their own kings became obsessed hoarders, driven mad by desire rather than loyalty. 3 of these rings were eventually destroyed by dragonfire, because what better way to punish greed than to have a creature that embodies greed itself burn the source of it to ash? The remaining 4 were eventually reclaimed, one by one, until every single dwarf ring ended up back in the hand of the one who forged the master ring to begin with. And that detail matters more than people realize. Even the rings that resisted direct control still fed their power back to their maker in the end. Now, the 9 rings given to men. This is where things get genuinely horrifying. Men, unlike dwarves, proved far more vulnerable to the corrupting influence woven into these rings. At first, the 9 mortal kings who received them became powerful beyond anything a mortal king should be. Wealth, glory, extended life far beyond a natural human lifespan. It must have felt like the greatest blessing imaginable. But that extended life came at a cost nobody warned them about. Slowly, gradually, their bodies began to fade. Not die, fade. They became stretched thin between the physical world and the shadow realm, until eventually they existed as something no longer alive and no longer dead. Wraiths. Servants bound eternally to the One Ring's master, invisible to mortal eyes except as dark hooded shapes, feared across every corner of Middle-earth as the most terrifying enforcers a Dark Lord could ever command. These weren't villains who chose evil. They were kings who accepted a gift, and the gift consumed them completely, erasing their names, their faces, their very identities, until all that remained was the ring's will wearing their shape like a costume. Then there are the Three Elven Rings, and these are honestly the most fascinating of them all, because they're the only rings untouched by direct corruption from their maker. Crafted purely by elven hands, without his influence during their forging, these 3 rings retained a kind of independence the others never had. One was set with a sapphire and granted its bearer wisdom and the strength to resist despair even in humanity's darkest hours. Another carried the power of healing and preservation, protecting its bearer's homeland from decay and time itself. The third, kept hidden and secret for most of its existence, held the power of fire, inspiring hope and courage in the hearts of those who might otherwise give up entirely. But here's the catch, and it's a brutal one. Because these 3 rings were still forged using techniques learned from the same source, they remained bound to the fate of the One Ring, whether their bearers liked it or not. As long as the One Ring existed, its master could sense the 3, understand their nature, and potentially seize control of them the moment he reclaimed his master ring. This is why the elves who bore them fought so desperately for so many centuries to ensure that One Ring was destroyed rather than used, kept hidden, or fallen into anyone else's hands. Their entire strategy for millennia was built around a simple, terrifying fact. Their most treasured possessions were secretly leashed to the will of their greatest enemy. Which brings us to the One Ring itself, not the flashiest artifact to look at. Plain gold, no gems, no obvious markings unless heated by fire, revealing script in a language so dark that speaking it aloud in the wrong company could get you thrown out of a room. But what did it actually do? Its most famous power was invisibility,